modern like justice today is the language of the oppressed and the oppressor,
Hmm.
right? Like, the oppressor is unjust and the oppressed are always just. But it's not that simple.
Right, the crucifixion of Jesus, both the oppressed and the oppressor teamed up together to crucify God himself.
Exactly.
Islam will continue to be triumphant until there have been 12 Khulafa, all of them from Al
The
Quraysh.
God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever.
This is my brother, my executor, and my successor among you, so listen to him and obey.
My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting.
Whoso obeys me obeys God. Whoever disobeys me disobeys God. Whoever disobeys my commander disobeys me.
The Lord said to me, You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession.
Two systems of government, two visions for life on earth. Whichever is true changes everything. This is Christ and Khulafa.
Last week, Ibaz and I went to the UW Palestinian protest, and we recorded an episode on that, and we talked about kind of like the things we saw and the sort of worldviews at play there. And last week, we promised we'd do another episode, which is sort of a slightly more kind of constructive approach to, or okay, well, if these sort of revolutionary protest movements are, ultimately dangerous and coerce legitimate causes into something nefarious sometimes. Well, what is the Christian way to approach these kind of things? So the first thing I want to do is I want to throw out an MLK quote and see what you guys think. So MLK said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
I mean, I feel like a lot of people agree with that.
Okay,
I've
go ahead. You should elaborate on that because I have a lot to say.
injustice. I not. I guess the distinction that I would make with that quote, I wouldn't say it's not true, but I would say that it's more poetic than. I mean, the distinction that I would make is like short term versus long term. I would argue that yeah, I could see injustice anywhere being a threat to justice everywhere. In the long term, yeah, I do think that that kind of pans out, but I don't know that that quote would have very much to do with like a war or something in that moment, like because I don't know if that makes sense. Long term versus short term impact of injustice in one place and then how it trickles in around the world, I guess.
My take on that quote is that only a Sith deals in absolutes. No, I'm just kidding. Um, Star Wars, guys, come on. Um,
Because just to be clear, we believe in absolutes in this room, right?
that's right, right. It's a joke, but the truth is, my, I would agree with that in a loose sense. It seems unenforceable, and also there's always going to be like injustice in the world. In a perfect world, there is no injustice. My main issue with that is the fact that um, people's standard of justice shifts, right? So that to me seems like the big pitfall in that, you know, um, because what one person would look at as an injustice is usually a more complex issue than it presents itself in. And if you take like this kind of like simple slogan like thinking to it that people are doing these days with the word justice, and definitely like trying to apply like a social context to it and not going back to the roots of whatever like the conflict is, right? Whatever the injustice is. You know, if I were to do a clumsy, quick analogy, I could say that, well, all war is injustice, but like, well then what about World War II, right? Like, there were atrocities being committed, and then the world had to stop those atrocities, right? So is it a just war or an unjust war, right? Like how do we what is the standard by which you're going to
Yeah, I
call
don't think you
something
could.
just or unjust? You know what I'm saying? And then where does that leave you in terms of solutions? Because like with George Floyd, people's response to whether or not the death of George Floyd was just or unjust lands you in a place where people are like, well, just get rid of the police, right? Which doesn't seem like much of a solution or a cure to injustice to me personally. And I know that there are people who agree with me and people who disagree with me. So I think that's like the disconnect between making an absolute statement like MLK did.
So World War II is a great example of this when we talk about these shifting standards of justice, because lots of people felt that the way the war ended was unjust. Mm-hmm. So with the Nuremberg trials, for example, the Allies wanted a kind of like limited prosecution of the people who really, 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 really needed to be prosecuted. And the Soviets wanted massive amounts of retribution and death.
Right.
And when you look at the Imperial Japanese, right, there were these awful atrocities committed in Asia. And yes, you had Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but then the West spent a lot of money rebuilding Japan and ended up making it like the wealthiest Asian country. And I think a lot of people around what was formerly the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere felt like that was like ultimately an unjust. They didn't deserve to be prospering again after all
Who didn't want the Japanese prospering?
The Chinese,
Gotcha.
the Koreans,
Koreans,
like everyone they invaded.
Philippines,
right?
Gotcha.
So, but I think you look back on the way the West rebuilt Germany and Japan, and I think you're seeing a much better world than would have existed had they simply gone the full, vengeance. You have to pay.
Mm-hmm. Well, the mistake,
I guess,
between World War I and World War II was that in World War I they didn't do that.
Right. It was
in World War I they just left them to you owe us tons of resources forever.
Right.
Right. And it it
created World War II.
It created World War II, right? Yeah. Like it was just too much of a heavy retribution, heavy-handed retribution.
Yeah.
And what you have is the French believing that this was justice, and the Germans believing this was injustice, and the only way to solve whose version of justice was right was by fighting again. And ultimately, if we're left in a world of standards without God, the version of justice that gets to prevail is the version of justice enforced by the winning side of any conflict.
That's what I was going to say, is back to the quote, like, for that quote to have any like consequences and not just be like poetry, is like you must define, there must be an undisputable standard, specific, objective definition of justice. It can't just be what people like deem at a certain emotional point in time. Like there has to be and that's why I don't think and that's why what you were saying, like, it doesn't work, that quote, because nobody is able to define objectively and specifically what justice is.
Well, I think they're agreed upon like norms, right? Like, murdering children is an injustice, right? But
unless you're an Aztec.
Right. You know what I mean? I think that's the thing. So
not blaming you for the crime of your maybe ancestor, Sophia. Just we're going to talk about the Aztecs.
Right. No, so that's a good point.
She's from Mexico, and all of the problems in South America came from your ancestors. So I demand justice.
Come on, let's not let the Olmecs off the hook.
Yeah, right. Or the Mayans.
Yeah, right. Aztecs were simply a branch of Nahuatl culture. They were not the originators.
Hey, man, I saw Apocalypto. I know what it was like. Such a great movie, by the way.
So scary.
I am Jaguar Paw. No.
So what you were saying
We're
though,
talking about
yeah, like
standards of justice.
there's people, there's agreed upon morals, and then there's like,
Right.
but
Well, I mean,
but,
I
yeah.
feel like what the Germans did was put people in ovens, right, and cook them alive, and gas them, and what the Japanese did was wipe out as many of the like it was like an ethnic cleansing of anyone that they didn't like, and then on top of that, what they did to their prisoners was horrible, right? So I think the agreed upon norm is that we don't believe by like like a even just like a pejorative like human moral standard that we should do those things to other human beings, right? I'm not trying to be an apologist for those points of view, but I know that there are people in those countries at those times who thought they were like, we're doing the right thing. So they were clearly wrong, right?
Which brings us back to
You know,
whoever's on the winning side is whose truth will prevail.
Right. Well, I mean, the truth is that there's a vacuum when it comes to these things, right? And the standard is subjective because there's a vacuum. So people like look at this idea of justice and, let's just take the United States, for instance. You know what I'm saying? Like if, there's this like 1880 sense of justice where it's like, well, hang them high, very like corporal punishment oriented, right? And then now in the 20s, we have this idea of social justice that's so prevailing. And you kind of see this conflict between the two of them, but in the middle, what actually is justice, right? Like, what does it look like? Where does it come from?
So, here's my thoughts on the quote. The idea of injustice anywhere being a threat to justice everywhere is true in a metaphysical sense. And if you're having, and if the idea of, and if you have an idea of sin and how poisonous it is, sure, that's true, right? Sin is a danger to the world. But if you're holding this standard up as a manifesto for human political action, you have to be careful with it because what it basically does is create an unlimited, never-ending battle, basically. Which, the struggle of righteousness against evil, for now, is that to some extent.
Is a never-ending battle.
It is a never-ending battle, but you've got to figure out like how to compartmentalize that properly. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a government with an army, and the slogan of that government and that army is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that there is the modus operandi for an empire at that point.
Right.
Because we, the people with power, must impose this power on a global scale in order to, eliminate like injustice. Right. It's actually, ironically, can become marching orders to perpetually oppress people forever.
Well, that's what happened in China, right? Like the idea that there was corruption, there was injustice in the political system led to the student uprisings, right? And Mao, and they have essentially used that as a way to impose communism, and do some of the atrocities that have happened in China since the imposition of Red China, right?
And so then on like kind of like on a practical personal level, right, from what we saw at the protests, and I'm talking to a lot of people who are in this space right now, whether it's Palestinians or people who are just sort of following everything, or even Israelis, that because everything is kind of broken in the world, they feel like they can never rest. They feel like they can never properly enjoy themselves, because how can they enjoy themselves when other people who they are connected to are suffering?
Right. Like it can lead to a never-ending kind of witch hunt for, again, I don't want to say like loosely, you need to pursue justice, but the idea that, everything. Like, they even have a slogan, no justice, no peace.
Yeah.
So okay,
right,
no
right.
peace for you, but also no peace for the person who's supposed to,
Yeah.
be the agitator.
Right.
Right? Like they're just constantly looking for a sense of agitation, because if you keep looking, there's always going to be something that you can consider to be unjust.
And so what I find is I'm talking to people who are sort of in this scene, and they feel this, right? No justice, no peace. And because there's not justice in the world, they cannot personally have peace.
Peace.
Right.
And the fact is that recipe means that no one in history should ever have had peace, and no one in the future can really ever have peace unless you can attain some, ultimately unattainable vision of like society. And that actually stops. That is actually a barrier to you getting any sort of like progress.
Because in the last, it is a barrier. It's so interesting because in the last episode, or like the last episode we did, where you were saying, Ibars, about how like a lot of this pursuit, or like the resistance, because that's what we read. It was like resistance is not futile, all of these things. It's like almost a like for the students, for people, it's almost like their way of retribution, their way of like equaling the scales, or like because yes, it's about this, like it is about about Israel and Palestine, but it's about like those individual people's like hearts and souls, and like kind of like, yeah, because admittedly what they're saying and what they're telling themselves is precisely like, we're never going to have peace, we're never going to stop doing this. And it's almost like a martyr, like it's funny how like religious this non-religious
It's a savior.
pursuit is.
I think it's more of a savior complex.
Yeah.
Right.
And
you
which
have
is
to,
like
ride in on a white horse and save everybody.
But I think they know that they can't do that. I think they're aware that they can't do that. So I also think that like there's like, we're just gonna be martyrs then. We're just gonna martyr our way through life. We're probably never gonna get what we want, but this is the way that this is how things are made right, or like this is how they get some sense that like
are
the skills are
setting themselves on fire.
Yeah.
This.
Right. And so that is it's like their way of setting things right, or like their way of, it's so interesting, of contributing to the scales of justice, but like there's no tangible just result that can come from that. It's only like, it's like literally in like how you said, a metaphysical spiritual sense that they're accomplishing anything.
So
It's a quest for their like, I don't know, their existential.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
right. So
Yeah.
basically, what this leads to is people fluctuating between anger at what's going on in the world, despair and guilt, basically.
Anger, despair, and guilt.
And anytime they find something in their lives that makes them kind of like happy, they watch a good movie, they enjoy a good meal, they laugh with a friend about something, they feel guilty because they should be protesting, they should be advocating, and people are suffering while they're having.
I mean, just go on any social media platform. There's like, if there's something out there that somebody finds like funny, for instance, right? Or inspiring, some clown out there is always going to try and insert.
Why are you talking about Palestine?
You know what I mean?
What
Like,
about Palestine?
yeah, or
blood is on your hands.
Palestine or BLM, or
Right,
like whatever the cause is. Right now, it's Palestine, and people are going to go to this kind of like moral high ground, right? Like, I have moral high ground, so I get to like kind of attack you and what you are doing, even if it's like innocuous, right? Like. And it's easy to get sucked into that. It's easy to see like where people take it, yeah.
So let's flip this now, right? So let's start moving towards the biblical way of thinking about this, and how it's the same, how it's different. So let me ask you this question. As a Christian, is our main goal as Christians for the earth to be full of justice?
Yes.
That's the main goal? What do you think, Ibars?
One of them.
One of them.
I mean, I think as a Christian, you're called to do what it says in Micah, right? I think it's 5:6-8. It says, "Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God."
Yeah.
Right. So that's some people say love justice, some people say do justice in the translation, but we are like the one doesn't exist without the other, right? Like do justice, love mercy.
We're commanded in the Bible.
Walk humbly with your God, right? Like the problem with just love justice
I think
without the other two things to balance it out puts you in a position where you can totally be like, well, I love justice.
Yes.
Right. And I'm constantly looking for justice. Right. But the way that God puts things in scripture, is usually like a chain of thought, a progression, if you will. Right. So if you look at I think it's in Second Peter, he talks about adding all of these things to your faith, right? And the first thing he says to add to your faith is virtue, which leads to knowledge. Not knowledge, which leads to virtue.
But virtue.
See, the thing is that when you follow all of those things to whenever this kind of chain is put in there, the point is that it's supposed to lead you to a place where God is. And it's supposed to lead you into relationship with God. But if you stop on the chain and you interrupt it, and you only put in one or two pieces, it's easy to become what Paul's talking about, right? Like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13 about, if I have not the love of God, I become a clanging cymbal. And he lists all of these things. Like I can prophesy, I can speak in tongues, I can give these crazy sermons, whatever, you know what I mean? Like everything it says in there.
Yeah, without the love of God,
if I have not the love of God, it becomes futile. And the love of God, very simple. So love God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength, and to love one another.
And pursue justice.
To love your neighbor as yourself. That's where we're supposed to land. With whatever we do in our pursuit of justice, in our pursuit of whatever, you have to land in this space, and that's the balanced space. Your pursuit of justice is supposed to lead you closer to God, and not trap you in an echo chamber of, condemning people or constantly seeking injustice.
So I would say that
I should preach on that next month.
There you go. I would say kind of a big difference biblically is that, while we are supposed to take the actions we can take, our ultimate hope is not in any kind of control of the world or revolution or political action, but our hope for justice is God himself.
I was just thinking
right.
if the phrase is no justice, no peace, what it really should be is no peace, no justice. And Christ is called the Prince of Peace and the one that will bring peace upon the world. And so living in that paradigm as a Christian of until Jesus comes, we're not going to get this peace and we're not going to get this justice, then I think that's, where we begin with okay, how we can then operate.
So let's circle back to the no justice, no peace thing in a minute. But I want to read you Isaiah 42, which is a prophecy about what the Messiah is going to do in the world. It says, "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice, or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law." So the rule of the Messiah.
What was that one in?
Isaiah 42.
Isaiah. Okay.
So the idea is
Messiah.
that the Messiah is bringing about justice in the world, but not in this crazy, loud, revolutionary way, right? He's not lifting up his voice and crying in the streets.
Right.
He's not damaging a bruised weed. He's not quenching a wick, right? This isn't the kind of justice where the ends justifies the means, and there's a lot of collateral damage.
Yeah.
And it's based on a standard, right? By the standards God himself has set. And God is the one who sets the standards of justice, and is the one that can, allow mercy as well. So those things can work together.
Yeah. I mean, you raise a really good point in the example of, Jesus in Isaiah 42. I think the thing that we have to keep in mind is like he willingly sacrificed himself where he could have totally screamed for justice, right? He was literally put in a pony trial, like a fake trial, and everything was set against him. Peter talks about it in First Peter, where he says that he didn't shout, he didn't argue, he didn't fight. He willfully submitted himself to the one who could raise him from the dead. Mm-hmm. Right? Like he I think about all this stuff and the stuff that we're saying, and it's easy to say it. It's hard, like, to put it into practice because, it's definitely unjust what happened on October 7th. And definitely innocent people are dying in Palestine, right? In Gaza.
Which is unjust.
Right? Well, just or unjust, I think the thing that you have to do is you have to leave it all with God. Right? Like, again, the Palestinians are sitting here saying, well, what we did was right because we've been oppressed. And again, all of this stuff that has to do with modern, like, justice today is the language of the oppressed and the oppressor. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, the oppressor is unjust and the oppressed are always just. But it's not that simple. Right? It's never that simple.
Right. The crucifixion of Jesus, both the oppressed and the oppressor teamed up together to crucify God himself.
Exactly. Right? So that's great. Ugh. Write that down, people. That's fantastic. But I'm putting that in my sermon next month. But the point is, the oppressed and the oppressor, are definitely like parties in this inequality, right? The brokenness of the equation. But Jesus is different because he does it for the oppressed and he does it for the oppressor.
Yeah.
Because he realizes that the core of both of them and the thing that's broken the world is sin, right? It's the sin of the world. That's what he came to redeem us from. And that's what he came to break. So the thing that makes him trustworthy in these things, right, is to say, he can redeem these situations. He can redeem October 7th. He can redeem the war in Gaza, right? And if we look at like what the Bible says about Gaza, for instance, it's a very uncomfortable truth for a lot of people, but it talks about in Zechariah chapter 4, 7, I can't remember, that Gaza would be destroyed, but whoever remains will be like a lion, right? So listen, that is saying something very uncomfortable to us as Christians. It's not saying that it was just or unjust. It's saying that God will redeem it.
I think, that just makes me think a lot of things. I feel like being like in America, it's difficult to like, because like the Bible talks about Israel. The Bible talks about Palestine. The Bible talks about like the Middle East a lot. Hence why we do this podcast. It doesn't really, there's nothing in there's like, and the and the Cowboys in America and like, like these people groups here and there. But like, ultimately what James read, all the nations are going to bow to Jesus. And so like moving into like what we can do as Christians is like be really literate in what the Bible does say about the Middle East and like these people groups, because it's true, like you'll find things like what you just said, like that God has a remnant and that there is war to come and there is bloodshed to come, and in our lifetime, and like we have to face that, not meaning that, and at the same time, like as Christians, like we're still called to pursue justice. We're still called to like not let like the blood of man like spill like that. And And yet we need to understand our place, and that like we don't control, we can't, these are things that we also can't, like you and I can't go stop the war in Gaza right now, right?
So changing gears here, right?
And so
What I want to kind of like land the last 9 minutes with here is going on to this phrase with the opening phrase, right? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right?
okay,
I think there's, if you apply that correctly, I don't have a problem with that. But the no justice, no peace, I actually completely disagree with that. Now, God's goal in the world is justice everywhere, right? It is to bring justice in the world. But actually, what Jesus says in John 14 is he says that, my peace I leave with you, not as the world gives. So the difference between the Christian approach to the revolutionary approach is that the revolutionary approach basically is trying to pile up broken things for the sake of a revolution to try and like fix everything in one fell swoop. In the Christian perspective, it starts with the biggest injustice, the biggest problem, the biggest root of everything wrong in your life is actually your relationship with God. And you need personal peace and mercy from God. And the cross is what brings about justice and mercy meeting together, right? The things you deserve to happen to you from a justice perspective are forgiven in a way that it both extends God's mercy and satisfies his justice. Then you have peace with God, which is the foundation of ultimate peace.
and the foundation of any tangible actions that you can do to help your neighbor.
Right. So God doesn't ever say to you, you cannot have peace until the world around you looks better.
No.
God says, I give you peace right now. Right now, that is the foundation for your life. And what we then do, and that starts with us dealing with our own problems in front of God. And then,
Yes.
person by person, individual by individual, we're tackling sort of small chunks of reality.
So what would you say, give us like 3 practical things to do as Christians, in light of that, in light that we have peace in real time and are not in,
available to us.
Yeah.
So, while you should care about the problems of the world, you should not be overwhelmed by the problems of the world.
Yeah.
Not only should you, you should not feel guilty for being able to rest and enjoy yourself and enjoy the people around you, and spend time with your spouse, your kids, your friends, enjoy a good meal, right? All of these things are
Good things.
Good things.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you need to do is God does want you to care about the world. He does want you to care about justice. All that's true, but he also cares about you as an individual and wants you to have peace, and he wants you to be able to
share in that with people that come here. I think the most practical thing is like people are hurting, people have family in Gaza that are here, that are your neighbors, that you can talk to, invite into your homes and have conversations. Like the Bible over and over is like, look out, especially when it talks about like tangible justice that can be done person to person, talks a lot about taking care of widows and orphans and like sojourners. And there's a lot of those now because of what's happening. And so like become friends with those people. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Pursue them?
I would argue that you should share your joy with other people who don't have it, right?
Yeah.
But you can't share your joy unless you yourself have it.
Yeah.
Right. So if you are denying yourself peace because of some catastrophe, you have nothing to give to other people, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're able to live a life which you enjoy,
yes,
that is meaningful, but you can also guiltlessly enjoy a meal out. You can guiltlessly enjoy watching stand-up comedy. You can guiltlessly enjoy, going to a concert or something.
Yeah.
Right? While also not bearing your head away from the world, because that's the other end of the spectrum.
And I think that's the one that Christians actually fall into more. than being overwhelmed and joining picket lines is more like they're maybe gonna go hang out with their church groups and that's it.
Yeah.
Not get out of their church.
Right. So there's two ditches here.
Yeah.
But
Well, what you said is a lot of the reason why young people leave Christianity.
Yeah.
Right?
So-
they don't feel like they're making enough of an impact or it does enough to change the world.
So that's why.
and that's true, right? So we need to not be like disconnected from these issues, and we need to not be overwhelmed by these issues. And the way we're not overwhelmed by these issues is by having a right understanding of what God is doing in the world and proper expectations. And the proper expectations is good spreads subtly through the world. It's not going to be in these loud ways. Jesus says the kingdom of God is like leaven in a loaf of bread or like a mustard seed. So it grows like a plant. And the things you can do as a Christian for something like this. What I'm trying to do, I'm trying to make friends with both Israelis and Palestinians at this point, be invested in them as individuals. Will that solve the conflict? Absolutely not. But could that kind of thing solve the conflict 100 years from now? Absolutely. It has to be solved that way because this is ultimately a human problem.
And the Bible says that it will be solved.
Well, yeah, Zechariah 11 talks about Philistia being like a tribe of Judah, being part of God's people.
Right.
But again, I think, and so many Christians are in this sort of like, not revolutionary mindset, but the world is too broken. The only thing that fixes it is Jesus physically coming back, right?
Yeah.
But Jesus has things to do through us now.
Yes.
He can make a tangible difference to the world.
Right.
And then this is the Christian approach to the world. It's finding ways to be engaged in what you can do, and the king and justice, righteousness, peace, all spread slowly, heart by heart, mind by mind, individual by individual, and eventually those things cascade.
Yeah, I think like I love this passage in Romans. It's Romans 12:9 through 13. Well, it's really 9 to the end of the chapter. 12:9 through the end of the chapter. And I think what I'm like getting from what you're saying, right? Like in being able to like enjoy like your life, and not being weighed down by the troubles of the world. Paul kind of talks about here. It says, Romans 12:9 says, "Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who bless you, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice and weep with those who rejoice. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another, do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly, never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all.
Nice.
Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. And then I love this last one, because I think this is so important. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And I think it's so easy to lose sight, particularly of the way that passage begins, right? Abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. And it's easy to sit there and lose sight of like the need to do good, right? In a sense of judgment, to just sit there and go, well, they did evil and let's just judge the evil. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But he just lays out all of this stuff. Like, don't let your intention to do good lead to a compromise with evil.
Yeah.
right? Leave to a compromise that leads you like further away from God instead of closer to God. And these steps here are important.
That's a really good
right?
game
Because
plan.
the hard part is you can look at like say like a Marxist sense of justice as a Christian and adopt it and wind up in this place where you're like condoning like lawlessness and chaos and brutality towards anyone, right? So if it's okay for like the police to be brutal towards somebody, it's okay for us to be brutal towards the police, and that is not what God is calling us to.
Right.
Right? Like, period. You know what I mean? And I think, that there's that example, but that doesn't mean you stop trying to uphold the justice for the person who's being brutalized. There is a whole like chain of commands here that God gives you.
Yeah, it's great.
And trying to like work that out and flesh that out with other people in a way that brings glory to God, right? Like, humble yourself, associate yourself with the lowly, but don't be haughty. Right? Like, don't be wise in your own sight. Like, look at everything that we saw at like UW, right? Look at this like total thing. There's a lot of this going around, and I know like from social media and people in my news feeds and social, so like all that there are people who are like they're totally missing the boat on this. They either go right to like David has to kill Goliath, you know what I mean, or we need to like understand where Goliath is coming from. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's not what this is about, right?
No.
It's easy to sit there and say like, one is too heavy-handed and the other one doesn't account for evil. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It doesn't understand that there was evil in the sight. I mean, you and I talk about this a lot, particularly in terms of Islam, right? Like, some people present Muhammad as, it's too little Islam, right? Or it's too much Islam. It ranges the spectrum of Islam is just like a religion of peace and there is nothing wrong with it at all. And, none of the prophets sinned and Muhammad never sinned. You know what I mean? Like, and then there's too much Islam, right? Like, they're all just trying to take over the countries and impose Sharia law on everybody and they're all terrorists. You see what I'm saying? In the middle of that, in the context of that, it's so easy to lose sight of what we're called to do.
Right.
And how we're called to live.
I mean, what you ultimately believe impacts everything here.
Right.
Right. So if you're a secular materialist, then this world is all we get. Right. So if you don't get the revolution you want now, you will completely miss out on utopia and happiness and all of that. Right. It's your only chance. In Islam, you have this idea of the dunya, that the earth is created as a test, and your job is to kind of pass the test here, do your things, and then you get taken away from earth to paradise.
Right.
In the Bible, the knowledge of the glory of God will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea.
Right.
And we have a hope that this is going to, work forever. That it's God Himself that's doing that. So our job is to do our part, and that part includes enjoying God, enjoying each other, resting, celebrating, having a life that's full of good things and is trying to make the world around us a good place that's ultimately going to last forever. And God is going to get there eventually. It doesn't mean we do nothing, but it means we recognize our limitations and we can be at peace with that because we know that God Himself
has no limitations.
Has no limitations, right? And it is in the process of putting the world to rights. This is not a question of if, it's a question of when, and that therefore we can do our part and live at peace with the future.
Perfect.
Guys, thank you for listening to Christ and Caliphate. We will see you next time.